I cannot tell if this is working or not. Oh, here we go. Sick. Okay. Alright, let's see if we can hear it on here. I need like a producer or something.
About the debate around abortion that are worthy of consideration. Let's start with their position and the problems it has. I believe Dean and Parker's definition of a person would be any living human organism with a conjunct of past or present and future subjective experiences.
There we go. Okay. Okay.
I'm going to start.
So, let's get all this up. Okay, I wanted to do this on TikTok as well, but I am a boomer and I cannot figure it out. So I had somebody request that I react to this. This is also kind of my way of goading Hayden Rhodea out to talk to me. I don't want to debate like super hard, but I would love to have a discussion with him to see what he thinks, because I've heard a lot of his stuff and sometimes he gets a little debate bro-y, but in general I think he handles things in good faith. And I think that I have a pretty similar view as Dean and Parker, so this would kind of be like how I would react to him challenging me, because I had somebody reach out and say that they wanted to hear my thoughts on this. So before we jump in, I will give context to what my position is and what I believe and what I end up defending in a lot of my debates, just because I think that that'll kind of help answer a lot of questions. I think I don't have a autonomy view. I don't really do the autonomy defense, so I feel like maybe if a lot of these arguments are similar or revolving around autonomy, we can kind of disband those, and I don't have a lot of qualms about calling it a life or calling it killing or calling it whatever. So hopefully a lot of these arguments I can kind of jump behind, but it depends on how he chooses to attack these things. I know that Dean and Parker kind of talk about this issue, and they get like, they kind of look for one example that's extreme, and then they kind of try to use that to break the position. I find that argumentative style to miss a lot of the important details in the conversation. It also doesn't address the vast majority of the conversation. That's kind of like one of those gotcha that looks good in the debate, but I'd rather talk about like the actual substantive issues. So hopefully Hayden wants to do that in this video too. But for me, I am pro-choice up to 20 weeks at the moment of consciousness. For me, I think I accept that abortion is killing a human life. I just don't think that killing human life is always bad. I don't think innocence is something that can apply to something that can't choose, something that can't be guilty, or at least a fetus is as innocent as a tree. So for me, the perceived benefits of the mother outweigh the zero harms experienced by the fetus. I don't think that preventing a consciousness from developing is wrong. I think that I prevent consciousness from developing all the time when I choose to not have sex. And so I don't think that just because it's natural that it's good or something we ought to preserve. I think that humans are now a part of the natural process and are able to influence the equations for why things bear out or why things don't bear out. So I don't think it's inherently wrong to stop a process. There's a lot of caveats that come into that. I think that it's a culmination of past and present conscious experiences. So somebody in a coma or somebody who's asleep was previously conscious, so they would have perspective. They would be able to technically experience nothingness, which is something that a fetus before 20 weeks wouldn't be able to experience. So there are some caveats. I'm interested to see what Hayden has to say, and hopefully I'll go through each of these points. But I think that foundation is really important, just so you know that I'm not like, I don't know, like avoiding certain aspects of this. So, but okay, let's jump right into it.
By explaining what I believe Dean and Parker's position on abortion is, as well as the problems I think their position has. After that, I want to discuss 5 arguments or topics related to abortion that one or both of them have commented on. And finally, I'm going to discuss 2 points about the debate around abortion that are worthy of consideration. Let's start with their position and the problems it has.
Already, again, kind of like I said, the argumentative style of pro-choice people and for pro-life people to find like one specific circumstance in which you would and wouldn't allow abortion, and then that kind of is supposed to prove the whole thing. I find that kind of frustrating, and it is just like feels really unsatisfying to have discussions in that kind of format. So I think some of these critiques that he's going to have, or that Dean and Parker are going to have for him, is something I'm not going to really jive with. And I'll try my best to explain why once we get into the specifics.
I believe Dean and Parker's definition of a person would be any living human organism with a conjunct of past or present and future subjective experiences. Here are some clips that clearly support this interpretation of their view.
I would disagree with future subjective experiences. I'd probably disagree with that.
First of all, I'll just tell you why I'm pro-choice. So I'm pro-choice because I only value life forms that would fall into a specific conjunction of traits. I value any life form that has a conjunction between past or present and future subjective experiences, and it's not until about 20 through 24 weeks that is true of a fetus. Therefore, prior to that point, I'm not going to associate value with the life of that fetus.
Okay, so like sapience plus sentience is what you're going to value.
Yeah, human plus sentience. So human plus
Okay.
past or present and future subjective experience.
I wonder why future is a part of this because the future like ours argument allows for future to be a part of this, but for me that seems unsatisfying at best to prescribe like a future experience or to say why that's valuable. I think that maybe the problem is that they're using value for what they're talking about. When I describe these things, I use personhood or value kind of as a proxy, but what I'm really talking about is now the fetus has the capability of experiencing harms or benefits. They can now kind of like play into the moral landscape, so they can be harmed. They can be benefited at 20 weeks, and that's something that uniquely consciousness allows. The value talk kind of gets into this weird, like I see why it's useful, but that kind of might be where the lynches are in this conversation.
I hold a conjunct to distribute moral value sufficient to grant the right to life. I hold the same conjunct as Parker, and that would be a conjunct between past or present, and future subjective experiences.
I think they're
Also, this language is super cringe. Like, just talking normally would help, although I think that Hayden's kind of at a level now where he can require this kind of conversation and it starts to be useful. But I think taking it a step back and having real conversation with real language that people use would be helpful. But I see why, that's why the value thing is kind of frustrating, because it requires that you prove this set of values. And that's why the conversation always leads into these extreme situations. I find that deeply unsatisfying, but maybe it's just like the language that they're using.
position can be restated more simply by defining a person as any human being that has both potential for consciousness in the future and has either had consciousness in the past or has consciousness now.
Has potential consciousness. Oh, okay. So are they wording this for like comatose patients and that they have future consciousness and that's why we'll value them? That seems weird. It seems like to me past consciousness would be sufficient to illuminate the distinction in that case, but maybe.
And for those who are inevitably going to comment saying that I don't know what a conjunct is, here's the definition of conjunct according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary: something joined or associated with another. If you use the definition of conjunct with their definition of a person, as they have described it in their own words, you will essentially arrive at their position as I restated it. The central point of contention between their position and the pro-life view is essentially the question of what a person is. In the pro-life view, a person is a living human being. Our view of personhood is not based on what human beings can do, but on what we are, human beings. In contrast, Dean and Parker's definition of a person shows that they value humans based on what they can do, deploy consciousness in the future, and at some point in the past or present.
This is why the term value is kind of frustrating to me, because even though I'm not going to accuse Hayden of doing this right now, it kind of morally loads the conversation, as in one, like, the basis for morality can be something that is just simply valued, and the difference that we're having now is they value something that you don't value. I don't really like the language. Normally when I'm trying to debate this conversation or I'm trying to have a conversation with people, I try to say that, like, if I were talking to Hayden in this situation, he'd be like, no, Hayden, you value these things, or like, these are things that you care about. They just happen to be associated with the things we value. But like, morality at its core is going to be harms and benefits, but harms and benefits can't apply to something that isn't an experiencer. Something like that. Like, I would try to work the conversation away from value because of this framing issue that's happening here.
If humans are valued for what they can do, then why would the definition of person exclude non-human animals who can do the same thing? For example, adult pigs are far more conscious than healthy newborn human beings, and they satisfy all of Dean and Parker's definition of a person with the exception of the human part. So on what grounds could pigs and other non-human animals possibly be denied personhood? It's especially important to note that Dean and Parker do not appeal to the higher levels of consciousness that healthy adult humans have compared to pigs. And frankly, I'm thankful for that, since if they did, then their position, if consistent, would deny personhood to some seriously injured born humans who may never become more conscious than some non-human animals.
I would say that a conception of consciousness that Hayden is expressing here is one that I think is hotly contested about how consciousness works, that there are levels of consciousness that you can grow into. I think that the way that I defend this animal-person distinction is that consciousness... Okay, it's that at 20 weeks, all of the brain parts that are necessary to deploy a conscious experience are there, and so we should assume that the consciousness level is the same as a fully grown human. We don't have evidence to assume otherwise. The evidence that we would have is could be purely justified based on the setting that the fetus is in. So the fetus is in the womb. It might be as smart as Albert Einstein, but because it's constrained in the womb, it can't express it to us because it doesn't have the motor skills to speak or to do something like that. Or maybe it doesn't have past experiences that it's able to kind of ground its current experiences out. It has a bunch of thoughts, but they float out into the ether because it hasn't been able to make sense of previous thoughts, or because of lack of experience, none of which we could fault the fetus for. And so you can kind of assume that the fetus is conscious at 20 weeks, or at least it's safe to assume that it's conscious at 20 weeks, whereas animals have meaningfully different brains and are never able to express a level of conscious at any point in their life. And so we make the same assumptive process. Even though consciousness, like we do grow, what you would describe consciousness is that the growth there is your ability to use that consciousness, your ability to weaponize that consciousness, or to describe and express that consciousness. But that doesn't mean that that consciousness isn't there. And so at 20 weeks, because the brain parts are there, you could assume, or like reasonably assume, that they're conscious. I don't think that like the animal human distinction is assumptive. Like, it's important. I think that it doesn't make you more pro-life. It either makes you vegan or more pro-choice, even if we were to grant this. But I think that there's a pretty good assumptive argument that animals aren't as conscious as humans, or that fetuses are at a level of consciousness, or could be at a level of consciousness, that it's too risky to kill them, which I think is consistent.
Furthermore, if the argument is based on humans' natural potential for greater consciousness than that of non-human animals, then human zygotes must also be considered persons.
This is why I dislike the future consciousness thing. I think it leads you into this trap that I don't know why the value would be there, other than maybe to dissect the brain dead situation.
This is because, like newborns, they possess this natural capacity, even though they
Or comatose.
do not currently have greater consciousness than that of non-human animals, then human zygotes must also be considered persons. This is because, like newborns, they possess this natural capacity, even though they do not currently have the immediate capacity.
This is why the value thing is frustrating, because it allows moral statements like this to slip through the cracks. It has the natural capacity, but the reason why we're valuing consciousness is not because we just value it. That's why the statement shouldn't be constructed like that. The reason why consciousness is important morally is because it allows for experience of harms and benefits. And so the statement that Hayden just said would obviously not align with that, because you will have the capacity to be harmed or benefited. But before that, since time only moves in one direction, so since before that, there is no harm happening before a certain moment, which is why they set a line in general. I wouldn't say it's because of some value rhetoric, although technically it is, or maybe it is, but that's why it shouldn't be communicated that way, because what we're saying is that intrinsically tied with harms and benefits is consciousness, and harms and benefits can't be enacted until consciousness is there.
Relevant to this point is a clip where Dean expounds.
The camera switches are awesome. I imagine he's like, and you should know this too. I like the way that he does this.
On his position, so I'm going to play it now.
So you're saying that the argument is that you think that it's...
Let's go, Kojo. Wait, did he reference Kojo in this?
Even though they do not currently have the immediate capacity. Relevant to this point is a clip where Dean expounds on his position, so I'm going to play it now.
So you're saying that the argument is that you think that it's wrong prima facie to unalive human beings, but that's only in virtue of when they satisfy both members of the conjunct.
No, I wouldn't say that's only in virtue of when they satisfy the members of the conjunct. However, when they don't, this would be like compelling reason. However, okay, there's like there's two conditions in which I think create the compelling reason. It's that they don't satisfy the conjunct, and there's like a violation of like the woman's right to bodily autonomy.
Very good distinction always is that this is like a comparative harms and benefits. So it's that's why I said it's compared to the perceived benefits of the mother as compared to the lack of harms towards the fetus. That's why the value thing is kind of frustrating. This is why people will say, like, what if a human was born and unconscious and like has never been conscious before? Are we allowed to kill them? Well, now you don't have like the positive benefits associated with stripping something from the mother's body that's there unconsensually. Excuse me. Or something like that. And so, like, it's always compared to the benefits of the mother, and these things will change. But the mother is an experiencer. I think that there are some benefits to producing children, to adding people to the world, and there are some harms associated with preventing a person from being in the world. It's just that those harms aren't experienced by the person definitionally because you stopped the consciousness from developing. And so the wrongness there is only via the perceivers who are in the world experiencing the fact that there isn't a person there and there would have been. That is a harm. It's just an incredibly small harm, and when you compare it to the perceived harms of being pregnant when you don't want to, that's just not enough to override the benefits of an abortion, if that makes sense. But people are good. I'm not like an anti-natalist. People are good. I want people in society, but I just don't think that pregnant people have to be responsible for that unless they want to.
Important part of this clip is where Dean suggests that his definition of personhood may be relevant only when concerns about bodily autonomy arise. However, if that is really his position, then he would have to oppose the intentional destruction of human embryos conceived in vitro, something that I highly doubt he actually opposes, and something which Parker clearly...
I think they would. I mean, it doesn't have to be for murderous reasons. Like, it could just be destruction of property, destruction of future people. Like, there are ways for that to be wrong that doesn't have anything to do with the extremity of it being a human or something like that. They might be opposed to it, like, just in general, but it just might not be for the same moralness that Hayden has.
Doesn't.
I wouldn't care about killing a zygote. You can kill 1 trillion zygotes and I wouldn't give a shit. If I slap a zygote under your view, I should go to prison, right?
Also,
well, when he's saying he doesn't give a shit, he means like in comparison to your view. I assume that there would be some like medical externalities from doing something like that. The time wasted, the time spent. It just wouldn't be for the reason that you're describing it as. But I guess in the way they describe it, maybe he is, I mean, like, morally, I wouldn't care for that reason. You know, like, I don't know. There's maybe some framing in that conversation that needs to be expressed.
so if human embryos are not persons, then what would be the issue with destroying them? If you saw Destiny's debate with Lila Rose, you'll recall that he made a somewhat similar argument when discussing a living born human who he believes never has had or will have consciousness. Lila pointed out that he would not consider such a born human to be a person. And so according to Destiny's view of personhood, there shouldn't be anything ethically wrong with killing the child. Destiny's response to this line of questioning was quite puzzling.
There is more to something being ethically wrong than just the perspective of the person. This is why I say that abortion is like a morally permissible act, but that doesn't mean like it's like a good thing. I think that people should have kids. I think that people should be reproducing. I think that people should be starting a family. And so like an abortion is kind of like an act away from that. So it's probably not good for you. But the question here that's being had is there something like gravely immoral with doing that? Are you stealing something from somebody? Like, are you unconsensually harming somebody else with this action? And so I think there's like, I don't know, there's like nothing wrong with this thing. With the framing of the abortion conversation, you can speak like that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's exactly what you're committed to.
This course has opened my eyes to all the different avenues that are in the IT world.
Do you think that because baby Jax is missing most of his brain and doesn't have consciousness, in your view, he should not have a right to live?
A right now, if the parents want to have that child and have that experience.
Does he have a right? If the parents wanted to execute him, do they have the right to do that?
Yeah, I think they could have terminated that pregnancy at any point in time, yes.
But as a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, does baby Jax have the right to live, or can he be executed?
I think you can make the argument that if already committed to having it, they can't change their mind at that point.
Why?
But
Why? He doesn't have consciousness. That's your
because I think in
definition
terms
for
of
human value.
Are you asking me the moral answer or the legal answer?
The legal answer.
The legal answer is if you're I don't think you can create a world where you're giving birth to some children and then changing your mind a year or two later.
But Destiny, your legal position hinges on consciousness as the standard for human value under the law. Baby Jax, according to your own statement, does not have human consciousness. Why would it be wrong to take his life at 2 or 3 years old?
So my legal position maximizes the right of a woman to do what she will with her body, because the most important part of my legal position is I'm trying to counterbalance the potential mishap of killing a human that might be a mind or a person before 20 weeks, whenever I decide, whatever the science says on that. And I'm trying to balance that against the mother's right to have an autonomy to her body. The right to her body cannot be invaded.
As you mentioned yourself, it is a big responsibility to take care of a child with disabilities at 2 or 3.
Sure, but completely different than having to give your body to it, and that balance is gone once the child is born.
Let's say baby Jax at, let's say 6 months.
I don't want to interrupt. This is like a really good dialogue, but this is exactly what I'm saying. Like, once you strip away the positives of the mother being involved, now the doctors who are taking care of it are consenting to it, and so like it's just like a completely different motivation to do so. There's also like a risk factor when it comes to us for determining what is the conscious experience of another person, and so I guess I don't know why Destiny wouldn't be able to bite the bullet on this and just say like, look, in this kind of situation, I don't know if we'd be equipped to assess the consciousness level that is happening here, and I would just allow for a medical doctor to decide what exactly is happening here, what level of consciousness is happening here. Whereas with no brain, if no brain had existed, which would be similar to like fetal development before 20 weeks. That would, I think, like there's a higher level of confidence in making that decision than maybe with baby Jax.
Baby Jax at 6 months old was completely 100% dependent on the bodies of his parents.
He was not.
Including the breasts of his mother if he was breastfeeding.
No, he was not.
Yes, he was.
He wasn't living inside the body of any of them.
Did baby Jax feed himself?
No, but he can be fed. He doesn't have to. He can have access
Who feeds baby Jax? Is it a robot?
It could be the dad. It could be the mom. It could
And
be a
are they
sibling.
using their body to feed baby Jax?
I mean, in that case, we're using our body for everything.
Yes.
But that's become so reductively absurd that it doesn't really make sense
It's not
anymore.
reductively absurd. This is why parents can go to jail for parental neglect if they don't use their bodies to care for their children.
No, this is why when you put a person in jail, you can imprison a person, you can deprive them of all sorts of rights, but you can't take parts of their body in order to make another person whole. There's
I
no
don't
part.
think it follows that means just abortion's just.
There is no other part you can.
Well, that wasn't the argument that's happening right now, because the idea is like autonomy and choice, and the people who are taking care of it, who are breastfeeding, which may be the mother or maybe the doctor, have consented to it, and you can give up those rights. And maybe the case of baby Jax, you could put him up for foster care or adoption, or have the doctors are the ones who are feeding him. And so the idea what Destiny is saying is you can kind of offload consenting to taking care of that fetus. But she just said that doesn't follow that that's justification for abortion, because we are way downstream of the actual conversation of what's happening here. And this is a hyper-specific situation where the contexts are different, the morality is different. And so, like, that kind of revealed to me what I was going to say from this conversation anyway, was that this is not this moment right here is not justification for abortion. And everything that Destiny's saying is correct in the way of how consent works and the differences between using your body. And this is kind of like an unfair, like weird way to spring up this conversation from Lila's position. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you can see that like this conversation is so downstream from a lot of other things, and to just like wholesale this specific point as justification for abortion, I think reveals how this conversation is being weaponized when this is actually like a hyper-specific context. Not saying that hyper-specific contexts aren't important, it's just saying that like the premises that might apply to this situation would be different than the premises that would apply for the normal cases of abortion. And that's like worth considering.
And conceive of past conception where we're taking people's bodies and using them for things.
Ask you.
If such a born human is not in fact a person according to Destiny's definition, then what would be wrong with intentionally killing him? Saying that there is no longer any infringement on the woman's bodily autonomy is in no way a sufficient response for a couple of reasons. Number one, I suspect that Destiny is fine with the intentional destruction of human embryos in vitro, where there is no infringement on a woman's bodily autonomy. And number two, Destiny doesn't consider it wrong to kill non-sentient forms of life, like grass. So from within his moral framework, why would it be wrong to intentionally kill a born child who has never and will never deploy consciousness?
Again, what you could simply say to this is that it wouldn't be wrong from the perspective of the child, almost definitionally so. Although there is a lot of moral loading with a grown human who has never been conscious. But when you actually try to imagine what that experience is like, that is a block of concrete. That is the same as smashing a block of concrete from the perspective of the person. However, we are all going to have an emotional attachment to the body that is there, and we're all going to be imagining some sort of perception going on. There's no way we can like undo that. But this would be like an unexamined intuition, and there are other smaller factors that would be in play that absolutely have to do with who is consenting to taking care of that, especially if they think that there's a possibility that they could be conscious in the future or something like that. It might be worth the resources to keep it alive. But I don't think Destiny is an anti-natalist, so I'm not sure if you could ascribe these exact positions to him. But I understand what Hayden is saying. He is somewhat consistent in this. I just think that there are other harms that are being kind of unaddressed, and the exact reasoning that's being used by Destiny here is being a little bit avoided, I think.
It's worth noting that treating conscious non-human animals as persons would entail an unimaginable reshaping of society. Would conscious animals be granted citizenship under the 14th Amendment, which says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside? Would they be eligible for programs such as the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, otherwise known as WIC, which provides nutritional assistance to low-income pregnant women, new mothers, infants, and young children to ensure they receive adequate nutrition during critical stages of development? Would pig farmers be convicted of mass murder if they kill their swine for food?
I think we get the point. I will just re-mention again that the vegan debate, while analogous in some senses would only bring you to be more pro-choice or personally inconsistent. It doesn't actually say much to the morality of the situation. What you could say is, I just don't assume that a pig or that animals are as conscious as humans. I think that it is of a different kind of consciousness. Though evidence might allow us to personify a higher level of consciousness in those animals, that doesn't mean that it is conscious. And so, like, you could make distinctions like that and just say, like, I'm personally stupid, I'm personally inconsistent, or I'm just going to be more pro-choice and like require a higher level of consciousness. I wouldn't agree with that. I think that the evidence is sketchy at worst, but I think it's in favor of the way that we perceive consciousness and the way that we view consciousness. I mean, even just the fact that I'm like looking into a ring light and a camera talking about these issues on such like a meta-ethical level should lead you to believe that like we are out of a different kind or a higher level of consciousness. But again, this is a vegan debate talking point. You could just say that I'm personally inconsistent, but I do think that there's good evidence for a difference. Also, he looks ripped in this.
I want to take a quick break from this video to let you know that one of the best ways you can support my channel is by shopping my merch, which includes hoodies.
The closest thing to fresh air in this office is your boss's screensaver.
Like giga
tank
chin.
tops, t-shirts, and more. That said,
buy his
position
merch.
on person. Having clearly stated and supported with evidence what I believe Dean and Parker's position on personhood and abortion is, I want to move on to some of the arguments that I've seen them bring up in previous videos and media appearances, starting with the now infamous question of whether women who use IUDs are murderers.
Because you're saying that it is murder to kill a human being right at any point in development, especially when it's in the mother's womb. My question to you would be, well, does this make women with IUDs murderers? Because it is the case that in some scenarios, an IUD will allow for conception to occur, meaning there's a unique human life there, but it will prevent its implantation, intentionally killing it. But on your position, you said that a human being is morally valuable at the moment of conception.
Agreed.
I would love to ask you a question. Do you think that women with IUDs are murderers?
So a woman with an IUD, you think she's a murderer? So if a human zygote is just as valuable as a fetus, is as valuable as you or me, well, if I were to pull out a 9mm and kill you right now, I'd go to jail for my birth. I should get
There are a couple of distinctions that need to be made before it's possible to accurately address Dean's question.
I would say that like this to me, like I understand what is going on with this argument, but this to me seems like really semantic. Like I don't know how much ground it would give from the pro-lifer just to like say like conceptually what I'm talking about is you are preventing a person from existing. I don't think any pro-lifer, once you explain it to them, would concede that fetuses are experiencing. What they're saying is that you are preventing a conscious person from existing that otherwise would have. And so like you are preventing a consciousness from actualizing when it otherwise would have. And so like a question about like prevention, like getting so hyper specific into the specific moments, like the pro-lifer could just like move it back, like whatever stage before that it happens, you know, someplace before that. I don't think that they're actually married to the exact moment. Conception, I think, is just a proxy for when they think this happens. So you could just move it. But beyond that, like there's some sort of moral intuition happening here. Like maybe there's a statement about intentionality when using an IUD that's important when the mother's doing it. I guess I don't know what Hayden's defenses are going to be. But to me, this just like, this is interesting to talk about, but like using this as like a gotcha point, I think is like, I don't know. This just, I don't vibe with this.
First, it's important to note that someone could be morally considered a murderer while not legally being one. For example, I would consider a woman who intentionally kills her preborn child by taking mifepristone and misoprostol to have committed murder according to the biblical definition of the word, which I would argue is the unjustified intentional taking of innocent human life. However, assuming that the abortion was committed legally, she would not be considered a murderer under U.S. and state law. Second, there's a difference between murder, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, criminal negligence as a form of homicide, and reckless endangerment that does not result in death or injury. I asked ChatGPT to create a table showing some of the similarities and differences, and here's what it came up with. Now, let's see how a typical use of an IUD stacks up against the legal definition of murder and the biblical definition.
Okay, I will just, I don't know how long I want to spend going through this point. I think that whatever he's about to say is probably accurate in like the intentionality of it. Although you can maybe, like there is an interesting conversation to be had about the intentionality of mothers who are choosing to abort their fetus if they don't believe that it's a human, that it's like just a clump of cells or whatever, or that it's not a person. Like you could have an interesting intentionality conversation, but getting into like the legal applications of this seems to be like outside of the scope of what we're talking about. And I wouldn't even mind agreeing with Hayden on this. Like, I would still just bring it to some sort of moral question about, like, why is it wrong to do this? Now, I will briefly address the biblical definition of murder. One, I don't know why we would use the biblical definition of murder, but I imagine that his, like, moral foundations have something to do with Christianity. But what I will say is that the word innocent doesn't seem like it can apply to a human who is before 20 weeks, who doesn't have the capacity to choose or to be guilty. I don't think a fetus can be innocent or not innocent. That seems like a very strange use of that word. So I'd absolutely challenge that, which would bring it out of conditions for being biblically murder. I would also say that the conceptions of human is, like, kind of interesting. Like, there's, like, the adjective human, and then there's, like, a human, which is, like, one entity, you know? So you can kind of, like, ship a Theseus it and, like, chop someone's arm off and hook it up to a machine to keep it alive. Is that a human? Well, no, because it's not part of the whole. You know, what if I cut you perfectly in half such that each half, you know, what if it was just your head? I just spit everywhere. What if it was just your head and I just chopped your head off and put it up to a machine, like Futurama? Like, which would be the person? I think your intuitions would kind of break free. But it just means that, like, being a human, even, like, almost definitionally, is a little bit harder, especially, like, biblically. So I think a lot of this would rely on some presuppositions that abortion is wrong, biblically speaking, to defend this use of, like, the biblical murder. I think I'm going to try to skip this section.
For this analysis, we will assume that an equal protection bill has been enacted. This means that for the rest of this section, we'll assume that the law is going to treat that would violate rights.
Business evolves fast. Our students are ready.
I'll just concede on whatever he's going to say about IVFs and IUDs being part of murder. To me, this just, like, conceptually isn't even, like, a majority of what the abortion topic is, and it just, I don't know. This just seems like a gotcha point. It doesn't seem like it's actually discussing what's really happening here. Like, I feel like you can get the same. I feel like it's just as ridiculous to say that abortion at 5 days is immoral. You know, like, you're almost arguing the exact same thing. You're relying on this intuition that there must be something wildly different between a fetus at 4 days and a fetus before conception. Like, to me, those are, like, meaningfully the same thing. So let's just talk about that. You know, like, we're already playing on the intuition. We don't need to go so extreme, I think.
Have a seat. On to the next argument. Should there be retroactive punishments for women who get abortions? Here's a clip of Parker arguing this with Charlie Kirk for context.
Raising Cane's is celebrating National
Hey, I'm giving you a ton of money for this video. Also,
whether you're
Chuck
backing
Norris
up your home,
Cane's thing, something
exploring
about
the
that
outdoors, or powering the job site.
So, like,
bad, like, just gives me bad vibes. Like, I don't know what it is. I can't remember what the term is, but, like, it seems not sacrilegious. I don't know. It seems disrespectful. Something about it.
Pedophiles, people who were married to children in the past and normalized in that society, should they go to prison?
Should pedophiles,
like, if you could go back in time, would you put those pedophiles in prison that married those children because it was normalized? They were deceived into thinking it's okay. Would you put them in prison?
You got to slow down.
Sorry.
Pedophiles should get the death penalty.
No, so you'd go back in the past, you'd give them the death penalty, even though they were deceived into thinking it was okay. But you said people who get abortions who are women shouldn't go to prison.
Second, but it's not currently illegal.
Okay, regardless.
Pedophilia
at that time, it wasn't.
No, I would not go back and retroactively enforce laws where things were currently not illegal.
You wouldn't put pedophiles in prison in the past.
Even if someone believes it would be morally justified to investigate or prosecute women for obtaining abortions during a time when the procedure was legal, the U.S. legal system does not allow for such retroactive enforcement. This is because of the constitutional prohibition on ex post facto laws. An ex post facto law is one that attempts to criminalize actions after the fact, making conduct illegal after it has already occurred and punishing people for it. Both Article 1, Section 9 and Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution expressly forbid this kind of retroactive criminal legislation.
Well, surely he's not asking, like, is it legally he's asking, like, your moral perceptions. Like, if you truly were convinced that it is murder, who are the murderers and why are they the murderers? This, like, I know murder is, like, has a legal definition, but hopefully there's more, like, morality talk about this, because this is just saying, like, oh, descriptively it's not murder, so we couldn't do it, or, like, feasibly, like, I think they're trying to ask, would you want to do this? Like, convict them for whatever, like, make it analogous to murder. Would you write this into law if you had infinite power or whatever? I don't think they're asking, like, a descriptive question.
Even if the law changes and abortion becomes illegal in a particular state or at the federal level, individuals who obtained abortions while it was legal cannot be prosecuted for those past actions. Retroactive prosecutions would require a constitutional amendment explicitly repealing the ex post facto clause or providing a carve-out for past abortions specifically. Even those who think it would be moral to have retroactive prosecutions probably recognize that it would be a horrible trade-off if it meant eliminating the ex post facto clause or normalizing the addition of amendments that add exceptions to it. A fair objection to my position would be to question whether or not I would support something like the Nuremberg trials, where some Nazi leaders were prosecuted for crimes against humanity, among other charges. And while I haven't done much research at all into the Nuremberg trials, my initial inclination is to support them. However, I think a key difference is that conducting the Nuremberg trials did not require eliminating constitutional protection against ex post facto laws within a country or normalizing the granting of exceptions to them.
This doesn't feel like it's answering the question. And I hope you guys get that too, that like, this is just a descriptive account as to how our legal system is set up. I think they want like, morally, do you feel like these, like, let's just ask even the simplest question. Morally, do you feel like these people are bad people? Do you feel like there's reasonable justification for people to believe that abortion isn't murder or it isn't wrong? And like, how would you punish these people? How would God punish these people? Like, there are so many ways to ask this question that they're trying to like get your personal opinion on this. So this to me is like an unsatisfying answer. This also isn't a question that I would ask because again, one, there's like this practicality trap, but again, it's just like, we know that abortion is such a contentious split issue. 50% of the population, or whatever. I think actually pro-life is the more is the smaller population of people. But even then, like, we know this is a hot button issue. We know that people have conceptions about this. So even if we were to prove that it's murder, like these questions to me, like he knows the current global dynamic about this issue because he's so experienced in it. And so they're trying to get that question, but I wouldn't ask this because I also know the current global dynamic. I don't know if I fault people for being pro-life even. Like, I could work this around and say that, like, everybody who's pro-life is super restrictive on women and they're, like, restricting the rights of women to get health care or whatever, which is a weaponization that a lot of pro-choice people do, that I find deeply unhelpful for the argument. But, like, I could kind of do the same thing and, like, retroactively punish people and call them, like, slave owners or whatever. So, but, I just find this unuseful. I find this dialogue unuseful. But it doesn't seem like he's answering the question just for, like, shits and gigs.
This is because the trials were not conducted by the German government, but by a collection of foreign governments. The Nuremberg trials also occurred shortly after the crimes were committed, whereas retroactive prosecutions for those involved in abortion would date back to more than 50 years ago in some cases, meaning that evidence which could exonerate some of the accused may have been lost over time. I also fear that retroactive prosecutions would lead to more economic, political, and social inaction in society as a whole, since people would fear that legal action sanctioned by their own government today may result in their prosecution by that same government tomorrow. Such negative effects dramatically outweigh any potential benefits of retroactive prosecutions for abortions. In contrast, the Nuremberg trials did not entail many of these risks, as they were conducted by foreign countries and held shortly after the crimes occurred.
I don't think he's going to answer this question.
Even if I am somehow inconsistent for supporting the Nuremberg trials, but not retroactive prosecutions for those involved in abortion, that doesn't mean that abortion itself...
Like, again, they're trying to get, like, the general concept of retroactive punishment and maybe even specifically applying it to abortion. So all of this seems, I don't know,
moral or should remain legal. It would just mean that I'm inconsistent in my position on retroactive prosecutions for certain crimes. The next
That's the exact argument that I'm using for veganism, by the way, that I would just be I would just be unaware of the consciousness of animals and I would be inconsistent.
Argument that I want to discuss deals with Dean's confusion about the differences between someone in a permanent vegetative state and someone who is brain dead. Here's the clip I'm referencing for context.
Ask yourself if you value clinically brain dead people. They are human, they are alive, they don't have consciousness, and we typically don't consider it murder to pull the plug on them. The only difference between you and a brain dead person is that you have consciousness, they don't have consciousness, and they never will again.
Someone who is brain dead is legally, clinically, and biologically dead. Furthermore, they are dead not because they will never be conscious in the future, but because they have lost organic unity.
No. Well, organic unity runs into that. This is a point that was brought up that I find really frustrating. Organic unity is like also asks for a ship of Theseus question, right? Like the organic unity presumably comes from the brain, which is why we're valuing consciousness in the first place. But organic unity is our brain's ability to allow all of our organs and parts to do what they're supposed to do together. And it's just this broad conception about what it is to be alive. But when he says like legally, medically, that kind of presupposes the whole point. We consider people who are brain dead dead solely because their brain isn't working. Just consciousness not being there is enough to consider them dead, which is why we consider them legally dead. So when Dean is saying that they're alive, they mean by in every other metric other than consciousness, they would mimic an alive person, except for consciousness, so we consider them dead. So to appeal to that definition, to get this point across, is like frustrating, because it's like, that's why we consider them dead. They actually aren't dead, though. They meet the criteria of being alive, except for consciousness, but that's enough to consider them dead, is at least my conception of brain death. And then this idea of unity is kind of like a way to kind of jump past, because you could always ask, like, what if I replaced your heart? What if I replaced every part of your body? There's only one part of your body that would no longer grant you unity, and that's the brain and consciousness. If I replaced every other part with robot parts and then had your brain and then everything else was functioning normally, you would consider that a human. And so, like, this is, like, really frustrating, or at least, like, the line where you stop considering somebody a human based on augmentation would be very, very thin. And so this unity kind of presupposes the pro-life point, and I have not heard a good argument for it. But let's see what he has to say.
There has been an irreversible breakdown of the whole organism's integrated functioning.
Just because of the brain.
Contrasted with just parts of the body failing, death means the entire self-regulating system collapses, even if
existing within only the brain.
Some cells or organs still function temporarily.
Every organ would be functioning except for the brain, or whatever organ we're keeping alive would be functioning because of the brain. But the alive part is what we're positing to be important.
In essence, to move from life to death is to shift from a coordinated whole to scattered parts. It's also not as if organic unity doesn't...
That's scattered is so... all of this, like, really presupposes the pro-life position. Hopefully I've said that well. I'm going to try to pause less, but hopefully, like, as you're hearing this, you can see the language that kind of presupposes the position.
Emerge until there's brain activity. Since clearly if organic unity were not present from fertilization, a human zygote could never develop to the point of having a brain. So while it is true that...
Also, the threshold for organic unity would be seemingly non-existent as a 10-celled organism. So, like, what it takes to be unified absolutely increases over time, and that's kind of why it's kind of like an unfair metric to use, because what it means to be unified as a 4-celled organism is completely different than what it means to be unified as, like, a full organism. And obviously that kind of makes the point that he's bringing up, but that's why I'm saying it kind of presupposes the pro-life view.
There comes a point in human development where the brain becomes the integrating organ of the body. It is not true that the human zygote is not a living human organism prior to developing a brain.
That wasn't the argument, that they're not a living organism. They would accept that they're a living organism, but that's why they're talking about the morality of it.
Even Dean would acknowledge that a human zygote is biologically alive. Using brain death as the marker for the death of humans with a brain makes sense, because for humans beyond a certain developmental stage, brain death truly is their point of death.
Yes, though it is not death, but we consider it death, which is the point that they're trying to
Since this is the point when organic unity is lost.
That's how you're describing it, but organic unity to me is a very, like, nebulous concept, and only exists when you're viewing it like this. And I would again ask, like, a Ship of Theseus question. Like he mentioned, or like he brought up the fact that the brain is the unifier, but you would have to have some, like, telos to production, to growth, to what that unity is for, what that unity is towards before when a brain is developed. Like, you would just have to, like, presuppose that development is the point of this, which, like, prescribes a telos, which doesn't allow humans to be in the process of development. Like, this is one of those things that I was saying, that, like, just because it's going to be something doesn't mean that we have to allow it to be something. Just because something is natural doesn't mean we have to allow it to take on its natural processes. We are now a part of nature. We get to influence nature. And when you say, like, the chances of a fetus developing into a person are 100% minus the miscarriage rate, that's not necessarily true anymore, because that fetus could be aborted. And if abortion isn't wrong, you have to calculate that possibility as the natural process of that fetus. Otherwise, natural is just whatever I want it to be. To me, humans are a part of nature, and outcomes are a part of nature, and we get to determine those outcomes. So that unity that he's talking about that exists before 20 weeks he would have to defend why it is the case, and I feel like it would have to be some sort of purpose statement about the purpose of the fetus is to grow, and that just would not jive with a lot of people.
Instead of brain dead patients, I imagine that Dean was thinking of people in permanent vegetative states, some of whom may be extremely unlikely to ever become conscious again. Please bear in mind, however, that there are significant variations in the prognosis for people in vegetative states. For example, some people are in a persistent vegetative state and are more likely to recover compared to those classified as being in a permanent vegetative state. I mention this because it's important not to paint with an overly broad brush when discussing these cases, which can vary significantly. Dean's main point seems to be that if it's considered morally licit to stop providing disproportionate medical care to a patient in a permanent vegetative state, resulting in their predictable death, that somehow suggests that what really matters to us morally is consciousness itself. However, the reason that many pro-lifers would consider it morally licit to withdraw disproportionate care from a patient in a permanent vegetative state is not that they actually value consciousness, but because disproportionate care is just that, disproportionate. And this is not some arbitrary standard that I'm trying to draw. While I'm not Catholic, I do think the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops provides a useful explanation of disproportionate care in Directive 57 of the Ethical and Religious Directive for Catholic Healthcare Services. They write, quote, "A person may forego extraordinary or disproportionate means of preserving life. Disproportionate means are those that in the patient's judgment do not offer a reasonable hope of benefit or entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community," end quote. For those watching who are Catholic, don't take my words in this video as what the church teaches, because I'm not Catholic and it's possible my position on what is and is not disproportionate care may differ from Catholic teaching. When the withdrawal of disproportionate care results in the foreseeable death of someone, what killed them was the underlying condition.
I'm going to attack this distinction in a second, but what I will say with disproportionate care is that the point that Dean is trying to make is that the reason why it's disproportionate is because of a steep devaluing of the human. Like, we wouldn't consider it disproportionate care to keep me on a ventilator in the current state that I'm in and I die otherwise. The reason why we are even considering it disproportionate is because the value of the human has dropped so significantly that now most, if not any, means of caring for this human become disproportionate. That's the moral statement that I feel like is trying to be made when you're illuminating disproportionate care. So just to say that it is disproportionate is kind of like jumping over, well, why is it disproportionate? It's because the value has dropped significantly. And so, like, I don't know if you could just jump over that. The other thing, too, that I find really frustrating is this distinction between the disease killed it versus somebody killed it. Again, all this is going to play into, like, the naturalistic fallacy that because something is natural that it's good or that it should be the way that it is, and it's also going to play into, like, our intuitions about, like, what is intentional. It's going to apply, like, telos and purpose to a lot of things that we're not just going to grant. And so it's like if every single abortion was just taking the fetus out and laying it on a dish and then letting it die, you would not be in favor of that, even though the thing that killed it was its inability to be alive outside of the mother, not necessarily us taking it out. If we're going to use, like, cutting off, you know, like, if we just allow the disease to kill them, that is very much intentional killing. I see, like, very little difference between these two, if any difference at all. And again, you wouldn't support me taking the fetus out of its natural habitat and letting it die. What you would probably say to that is that, what Hayden would probably say to that is that it is not natural, but again, that's going to prescribe some telos, as if human intervention isn't natural or there's, like, anything good or important about a natural state that has anything to do with killing, I think. This would just need to be explained a lot, and I'll see if he does it.
Not the people who decided to withdraw the disproportionate care. In contrast, if someone were to shoot someone in a permanent vegetative state resulting in their death, that would be murder. And I would be curious to know if Dean would support murder charges for someone who shoots and kills patients in a permanent vegetative state. If he does, that would show that he still considers them to be persons.
Consider, again, like, the legal stuff I find deeply unsatisfying when we're talking about these things. Still consider it a person. These are, like, strange ways to talk. But what he maybe means is, like, would it be immoral? This is, to me, maybe similar to, like, the double homicide thing that pro-lifers bring up all the time, that, like, killing a pregnant woman is double homicide. That means that it must be a person or something like that. This also, like, is jumping over the consent debate that pro-choice people are trying to have. So like what they would say is that it would violate the consent of the family in that situation to kill somebody unconsensually. Could the family shoot the comatose person in the head? I would find that meaningfully the same as pulling the plug. Would I find the action grotesque in other ways? Yeah, certainly. But like the act of killing or like the morality of killing would be identical to me. If the family chose to do it, whoever like has the ability to choose.
In short, while withdrawing disproportionate care may result in the foreseeable death of someone, that is clearly different from intentionally killing them.
I don't see any difference between that, and that needs to be substantiated more, I think. The other thing, too, is that similarly to maybe the other examples that he brought up, is this is still disanalogous, like the brain death is still disanalogous because you have past consciousness. And so, like, there are preferences that can be stated, there are so many things that would justify like past consciousness, none of which apply to the fetus. The only thing that the fetus has is a future consciousness. And so, like, again, like you could, even if you were to like really get to the hammer and nail on the comatose patient, you would still have to address the fetus thing. But because he's framed the argument as being valuable humans, it's much easier to dissect what is happening here. Because you can just like say like, okay, well, here's a human that doesn't fit within your qualities. There, it doesn't work. But I think if you like take a step back and get even like more meta about it and about what is right and what is wrong, it's a lot easier to kind of just like avoid these kinds of criticisms.
Contrast, pregnancy is both proportionate and ordinary. In fact, it's so ordinary that every human being is the product of it. The next clip I want to talk about is...
ordinary presupposes that whole thing. It's also now ordinary to have an abortion, seeing as, you know, what is it, like 1/3 of Gen Z has been aborted. Abortion has become somewhat of a mainstay in discourse and in the United States. So I guess it's ordinary too. Like, again, all of that has like a purpose embedded within it.
This one from Jubilee.
So I want to go on to abortion, because abortion was talked about a lot when it comes to family values.
Yeah.
I really don't think if a party is pushing for adoption to raise a child versus murder, that's not shying away from family values. It's not against family values. Because if that was really true, how come in pretty much every single state to date, if somebody is to term or carrying a child and they get murdered, is a double murder? It's not a single murder, it's a double murder.
Sure.
So if the judicial system looks at it that way, shouldn't abortion be looked at the same way, or is it based on the person decide, oh yeah, I could kill somebody or not?
Yeah, I can explain that to you. So first of all, I would like to tell you why I'm pro-choice. That's because I don't value, right, a unicellular life form that doesn't have the ability.
Granted, he's using the word value. I'm not trying to like presuppose Dean's conversation. I don't like the way that Dean and Parker talk about this thing. Same with Destiny too. I feel like this is like it's a good position to defend, as in like it aligns closely, but the language and the way that you defend it just like leaves a lot of conversations that I feel like don't get down to the meat and potatoes as to what exactly is happening here.
To display like first-person subjective experiences, right? I don't value the fetus until it has that ability. That comes at about 20 through 24 weeks. But now that we got that out of the way, you do ask a great question, right? How can I say that abortion isn't murder, then turn around and support legislation that would allow someone that kills a mother that is pregnant to be charged with double homicide? Well, I could tell you through an analogy. Let's say you have a car. What kind of car do you drive?
I drive a Malibu.
You drive a Malibu, okay. So if you go up to your Malibu, I mean, after we're done debating here and you break the windshield, did you do anything wrong?
Yeah, I mean...
No, it's your car, it's your property, you can make that decision.
It depends on what view you look at it.
Let's think about it this way. If you go up to your car and you consent to breaking your car's windshield...
Yeah, this is the whole point, is that, like, if there's nothing else wrong with abortion, then like the pro-choice side is that there's nothing wrong with abortion, and therefore the mother should be able to do it because it's in her body. And so like obviously the double homicide thing is going to be consistent with that, because what they view an abortion as being is like a medical procedure, something that you're allowed to do. And so it's like of course you'd be able to, this wouldn't be inconsistent. Also, legality is not a great basis to argue morality, as legality is just a proxy for what we want morality to be.
You didn't do anything wrong there. You have a right to do that. But if someone else just walking down the street goes up and breaks your car's windshield without your consent, did they do something wrong?
I mean, if you okay, for example, let's say this. If I go out on the street right now...
Wait, do you mind just answering my question so I can explain this analogy to you?
Go ahead.
So if someone else like walking up the street breaks your car's windshield without your consent, did they do something wrong?
I agree, yeah.
And that's the same way I think if a human died in within a room without...
Skechers Aeroburst are designed with aerodynamics in mind.
This is kind of what I was explaining.
Speed. Skechers Aeroburst.
Hopefully well earlier. This doesn't seem super inconsistent. I can't remember why Hayden brought this up. We'll see what he says.
They're being charged for a double homicide, which makes no sense in his position. If the unborn are not persons prior to consciousness, then there can be no second homicide charge for the unborn child. There's no getting around this.
This is yes, there is. I feel like the way that he described it was sufficient enough, but it would be a difference of opinion, right? Like, you also, I know a lot of choicers who argue that this should just be destruction of property or something like that. And so the idea is that the mother is now a part of the natural process of this fetus. So whether or not the baby gets delivered is based on the mother's decision. And that's why it's like her property, her decision. And so it's always a human. It's killing a human. And double homicide isn't like killing a person. They use the same conception of human as like you guys do. Just like it would be killing a person. So I'm not sure. Like, I don't know. All of this again is like playing into this really weird legal language that doesn't actually say much about the morality. I think Dean maybe defended the morality of it, but in the states where this isn't the case, then this wouldn't apply. And I feel like that would be unsatisfying for Hayden too. And so I don't know. Arguing the legality of this, I find like deeply unsatisfying.
He can't say that the personhood of the unborn depends on his or her relation to the killer. To me, what this really shows is that Dean actually just supports special murder rights for mothers up to a certain point.
Special killing rights, right? Because murder would be unjustified unless you're using the definition of double homicide, because homicide is different than murder, right? Homicide is killing. Am I right? Like, they wouldn't call it, the guy said double murder, but I've only heard it as double homicide, which is what Hayden is using, right? So it would be homicide. It would be killing a human, right? But the value of that is where the charges would be brought or not, right? And so that's kind of like a state-by-state issue.
And his arguments surrounding personhood are a veiled attempt to justify what otherwise is an obviously illogical position. And for those pro-choicers who might be quick to change their position and argue for a single homicide charge instead of two, I want you to answer this following hypothetical honestly.
All right.
Imagine your sister is 10 weeks pregnant with a baby girl, whom she has already named Sarah. Wanting to prepare for her arrival, your sister moves from a small studio apartment to a larger townhome. She buys personalized baby clothes with Sarah's name embroidered on them, decorates a nursery with wallpaper, assembles a crib, and arranges the room with the care and excitement that we would expect from a loving mother. Her boyfriend, the child's father, has so far acted supportive, but recently he crushed up the abortion pills mifepristone and misoprostol and secretly put them in your sister's pancakes. She unknowingly ingests them, and her unborn daughter dies as a consequence. He later confesses to what he has done, and she wants him to be charged with murder. Would you support those charges? And if you would, doesn't that show that all these arguments around personhood are just a veil covering your real position? Which is that
I wouldn't consider it murder. I'd consider it destruction of property. I would consider it like a loss of life, objectively, like I would be killing a human. And I would consider it as immoral as preventing somebody from existing unconsensually. This would be like my body, their choice. So it would be like horrible in a lot of situations, but to consider it murder from the child's perspective, I'm not like, it wouldn't be murder it wouldn't be wrong from the child's perspective because the child didn't have perspective. And so it would be wrong for a litany of other reasons. And if you wanted to consider it murder, like you maybe could, but it would be murder from the perspective of the mother, which I would find accurate, but that's the perceiver. It's not the child, right? Then that's because the mother valued it. I don't know if this is inconsistent, but this seems, if you understand the position, this seems kind of obvious. I'm not sure.
Mothers should have
what he's saying here.
rights to kill their preborn child until a certain point in their development.
Yes, that's what they're saying.
Dean's response to the double homicide question makes no sense, since it treats the unborn as property if the mother is the one willing the killing.
Yes, because it's in the mother's body, which is the pro-choice argument, yeah.
But as a person, if she's not the one willing the killing.
If they don't consider, again, this would be the value thing. I don't know if they would consider it a person. They would consider it a potential person, which the mother would also consider a potential person. The mother is just stopping that potentiality. And when somebody else does it, it's stopping the potentiality of another person. The mother stopping the potentiality of her own kid isn't wrong because she is in control of whether that potentiality actualizes. When another person does it, it's still doing the same thing, but now there are more people who are harmed by this.
If Dean wants to switch his argument to being one based on bodily autonomy, he's welcome to do so. But that position argues for abortion up to birth and has other issues. Since for now that isn't his position, I'm going to hold off on rebutting bodily autonomy arguments for the sake of focusing on the arguments that he and or Parker
Good, bodily autonomy arguments are bad.
have made. Now for the all-important question of who to save, 1 human baby or 10 human zygotes.
Here we go.
On another hand, when you tell me that you value any and all human lives, ask yourself if you value a unicellular human organism. Would you rather save 1 human baby or 10 human zygotes?
There are so many problems with this question that I'm going to first list them and then explain them more thoroughly. Number 1, this question more closely relates to IVF than abortion. Number 2, choosing to save some people over others does not imply that it should be legal to kill those who are not chosen. Number 3, the use of a newborn in the hypothetical may implicitly support the pro-life view. Number 4, moral intuitions can be wrong, especially in cultures where prejudice against certain human beings is rampant. Starting with the first point, Dean's question more closely relates to IVF than abortion.
Again, you could frame the question as 2-week-old. Like, you know, a 2-week-old fetus somehow hooked to a machine or whatever.
Since in the case of abortion, the child is already being gestated in the mother's body. Risks like death during the thawing process would not be present for a child already being gestated, but would be present for frozen human embryos. Rephrasing the hypothetical to one more analogous to the abortion conversation would look like the following. Which would you rather save? 99 pregnant women or 100 non-pregnant women? In this case, I imagine even most pro-choicers wouldn't consider it unreasonable for someone to save the 99 pregnant women. Also, suppose you had a choice between saving a healthy, dearly loved family member or 2 term...
99 pregnant women and 100 women. And 100 normal women? I guess at what point? If it's before 20 weeks, then you would save the 100. That seems obvious to me, but okay.
Terminally ill 99
I guess maybe that's like my presupposition of the pro-choice view.
Olds, each with only a week left to live. A lot of people might choose to save their family member, but that wouldn't mean that they don't consider the terminally ill to be persons or that they think it should be legal to murder them. The use of a newborn in the hypothetical is particularly interesting. On the one hand, using newborns in hypotheticals surrounding abortion is often useful, since newborns are closer to the unborn in many aspects than an adult human being is. However, it's worth noting that we extend great care to newborns, particularly because they are weak, dependent, and defenseless. For example, if first responders to a hurricane saw a woman and her newborn on top of a car on a flooded street, they would likely prioritize getting the newborn to safety, since he or she is more dependent on the care of others.
Okay, this hypothetical I find frustrating on like a lot of ends. What he's saying too is that it doesn't necessarily justify the killing, but that's not what the hypothetical is supposed to say. It's not supposed to say that you justify the active killing of one. It's just assessing like where your values are at. That like just current consciousness and past consciousness alone are enough for you to prioritize that over any amount of frozen zygotes that have no perspective, because then you could change it to 2-week fetuses, like who are there somehow medically. What all the hypothetical is saying is that your values of humanness are absolutely thrown out the window when presented with a current conscious experience. It's not necessarily that it's okay to kill, which I do find a lot of pro-choicers weaponizing this hypothetical as. I wouldn't say that it's that, but I do say it does illustrate a very interesting changing dynamic about how your values are.
If this logic were applied consistently, our culture wouldn't dehumanize the unborn based upon their high levels of dependency and neediness, but would instead extend great care to them, much like we do with newborn human infants. Our moral intuitions can also be wrong. For example, in the early 1800s...
This is a good point, that like... This isn't necessarily a defense, but this is trying to play at the intuition that exists even within Hayden, that experiencing is a very, very important part of the morality of killing or murder or whatever. And so this does illustrate that, so I don't want that to be left unchecked, but it doesn't do exactly what the pro-choice people are saying it does, but it does illustrate a good point, if it can be like weaponized well.
If you ask some white Americans in the South whether they would rather save 1 white American over 2 black Americans, it's quite possible that some or most of them would have said that they would save the 1 white American. Yet they would have been wrong, because morality isn't determined by a popular vote and all human beings are created equal. Moving on, I want to briefly discuss the question of whether abortion should be left up to the states. I don't know what Dean and Parker's position on this is, but I think it's worth briefly discussing a few.
I think abortion should be left up to the states, and that's mostly just because I'm pessimistic about our ability to find an answer on this. I do think the pro-life view is more reasonable than the pro-choice people give it credit for. I think it's unfounded, and I think that they need to find better ways to explain it that doesn't just weaponize language to get their points across. I think that there needs to be a much deeper moral conversation about what's happening here, but I do think, unfortunately, it should be left up to the states. So I'm going to skip this part just because I am running out of time. Don't buy these gummies with GLP. I've heard of this. This is like a weight loss thing. Yeah.
All abortion-related violence and political violence. Shifting gears, I want to close with one final thing that I believe people with Dean and Parker's position on abortion and personhood should consider.
Okay.
According to the 2022 abortion surveillance report from the US CDC, about 1.1% of abortions in 2022 were performed at 21 weeks or later. Abortion was defined for the purpose of their surveillance report as follows: an intervention performed within the limits of state and jurisdiction law by a licensed clinician, examples being a physician, nurse-midwife, nurse pregnancy, early pregnancy failure, to be legally induced. It makes sense.
Basically, this definition is just saying that it's not going to be like birth. It's not going to be like inducing birth. It's going to be like the killing of the fetus.
To take the 1.1% of abortions that they report occur at 21 weeks or later and multiply it by the roughly 1 million abortions that took place in 2024 as estimated by the Guttmacher Institute. When this is done, I estimate that there were roughly 11,000 abortions last year that intentionally took the life of unborn humans that Dean and Parker would presumably consider to be persons. Keep in mind that according to the FBI, the number of females who committed homicide in 2024 was 2,059. So if Dean and Parker did support charging these women with murder, the number of females imprisoned for homicide would increase about 5-fold, assuming that there wasn't a significant reduction in the number of women getting late-term abortions were it to be criminalized. It's also not as though these abortions are to save the life of the mother, since at 21 weeks or later,
I would just consider this immoral. It's like the way that I describe it is it's immoral to have an elective abortion after 20 weeks. And so like if this is just I would rather kill it than let it live. Like, I feel like at 20 weeks, you've kind of made the decision and you now need to suffer from your indecision before that because you are now harming a third party who didn't consent to being there. I do believe that consent to sex is consent to pregnancy. Sorry. I do believe that consent to sex is the allowance of pregnancy. And so for me, like the fetus didn't choose to be there. So if there is a perceiving entity in there, it is immoral to kill it. I'm not sure what the point of what he's bringing up is yet.
There are no instances that I am aware of where it would be necessary to kill an unborn child in utero and deliver them dead rather than simply delivering them alive, with the possible unfortunate consequence that they may die shortly following delivery. The earliest known case of a prematurely delivered child surviving outside the womb occurred at exactly 21 weeks of gestation. For those doubting what I just mentioned, here's ChatGPT's response. Save the life and deliver it might die shortly after delivery. See, on really rare, almost all medical.
This is a new pro-life talking point about the about when the mother's life is at risk and how that affects abortion. I think most pro-life people have the conception that if it's between the life of the mother and the life of the child, that it's totally reasonable to do the life of the mother. But now they're saying that there are no situations in which the life of the mother is at risk. I don't even need to play in this realm because of my moral intuitions about having an abortion after 20 weeks. I would agree with them in all of those cases. So the question of whether or not those happen is up for grabs. What I will say is there is an interesting pragmatic question about legislating abortion up to a certain point. I hear a pro-choice talking point that even if you disagree with abortion morally after 20 weeks, we don't really know if we could pragmatically legislate at 20 weeks because then it requires people to prove that their life is at risk, which might slow down the care process and end up killing women, which I have heard accusations of this happening. So what I will say that from this point of view, I'm not going to address this just because it's not something that I personally agree with, but I will say from Hayden's point of view, this is a point of contention and maybe worth looking into from both sides about is it actually possible or reasonable, or does it happen that mothers need life-saving abortion care?
Need to cause fetal death beforehand.
Okay. We will end it here just because I'm running out a little bit of time, but I think that this video is pretty good at addressing some of these points, although I do find that the morality of this conversation is not really being addressed here. It seems way descriptive, which is a point that I find is almost intentional from the pro-life position. The pro-life position kind of just relies on descriptive truths, and they hope that the moral intuitions that you have will provide the prescriptive answers. So abortion is killing a human. That's the end of the statement. but the intuition is that killing humans is wrong. But when you investigate the wrong part of it, there's way more conversation to be had here. And I found that a lot of this was appealing to the legality of certain situations, which I find is essentially doing that same thing. And so I would have preferred way more of a moral conversation. And I'm not saying that, like, he doesn't have moral intuitions or conversations about these things, but I feel like it's way more important than what was being discussed here. So admittedly, I'm a little disappointed. I found that it was hard for me to even respond to some of these things because it wasn't getting at what I feel is the real abortion conversation. A lot of this was what is attractive about the abortion conversation, and what is descriptive, and that doesn't really do a lot to tell us, like, should abortion be legal? Is abortion moral? There's not a lot of description that you can do for that, or there shouldn't be. People have intuition, like abortion is healthcare, abortion is a woman's right, whatever. They do the same thing. Pro-choice people do the same thing. But I find it, like, deeply unsatisfying when conversing with people. So I'd love to talk to Hayden about the morality of this and to just, like, see if his views have changed, to see how he talks about these issues in that realm. Maybe I'll watch more of his stuff. So if you guys have recommendations of what I should watch next, I'm very receptive to this. This person messaged me maybe about a week ago, and I finally got live set up so that I can do it. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and let me know if there are other debates or conversations or videos you want me to react to. Now I have to figure out how to shut this off.